When people think about food during the Second World War, the images are, well, pretty familiar. Ration books, long lines outside shops, housewives stretching just a few ounces of butter or meat across an entire week. It's remembered as a period of scarcity, improvisation, and constant shortage. But that picture is incomplete. Hidden behind the rationing system was actually one of the most disciplined and successful civilian food production efforts in modern history. Across Britain, the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe, millions of small gardens were organized with a level of planning that allowed families to harvest vegetables nearly every month of the year, even through winter. These weren't just casual backyard gardens, they were structured systems. Carefully planned crop rotations, cold frames, root cellars, and staggered plantings ensured that something edible was always growing or being harvested. In wartime, Britain alone, these gardens produced millions of tons of food and supplied a significant share of the nation's vegetables. Yet what's remarkable is not just that they worked, it's that after the war, the knowledge that made them possible gradually disappeared from public education and everyday life. The Dig for Victory campaign transformed ordinary land into a decentralized food network. In 1939, Britain entered the war with a serious vulnerability: food imports. Before the conflict, the country relied heavily on shipments crossing the Atlantic. When German U-boats began targeting merchant convoys, it quickly became clear that imported food could not be trusted to sustain the population. The government's response was not limited to rationing. Instead, they launched the Dig for Victory campaign, one of the largest civilian agricultural mobilizations in modern history. Lawns, parks, sports fields, railway edges, factory grounds, and vacant lots were converted into food plots. Allotment gardens, small rented parcels of land, expanded dramatically. By the middle of the war, more than 1 million allotments were in use across Britain. The goal was not simply to grow vegetables, it was to build a distributed food system that enemy bombers or naval blockades could not easily disrupt. Decentralization was the strategy. Every garden reduced pressure on the national supply chain. But for this to work, citizens had to learn something most modern gardeners rarely practice: how to produce continuously, not just seasonally. The typical modern backyard garden follows a pretty familiar pattern: plant in spring, harvest through summer, and then shut everything down when cold weather arrives. Wartime planners knew that approach would fail under rationing conditions. If vegetables were only available for a few months each year, the food gap during winter would still strain the system. So governments and agricultural organizations published detailed manuals explaining how to maintain a steady food supply across the entire calendar. This required a combination of strategies. Planting schedules were staggered so that early, mid-season, and late crops matured in sequence. Hardy vegetables like kale, leeks, Brussels sprouts, and winter cabbage were chosen specifically because they could remain in the ground through frost. Cold frames and cloches, simple protective covers made from glass or plastic, allowed gardeners to extend growing seasons by several weeks on either side of winter. Root cellars and storage pits preserved carrots, potatoes, turnips, and beets for months without refrigeration, and succession planting ensured that when one crop finished, another immediately replaced it. The result was not a garden that produced constantly in the literal sense. It was a system where food was always either growing, being harvested, or stored. From a survival perspective, the difference is enormous. By 1943, the results were undeniable. In Britain, civilian gardens and allotments produced roughly 1/3 of the nation's vegetables. Some estimates place the total harvest at more than 1 million tons annually. In the United States, the Victory Garden movement reached a similar scale. At its peak, nearly 20 million gardens were active across the country. These gardens produced about 40% of the nation's fresh vegetables during the war years. The key point is that this production came from ordinary households. Factory workers, office clerks, teachers, and retirees were growing food with basic tools and small plots of land. For governments concerned about wartime resilience, this was an extraordinary achievement. A decentralized network of small producers had become a major pillar of the food supply. It also revealed something that modern food systems sometimes obscure large populations can grow a significant portion of their own food if the knowledge and structure exist. Many wartime gardening methods were not new. They drew heavily from older European traditions of intensive small plot farming. Market gardeners in France and Britain had long practiced techniques designed to maximize productivity in limited spaces. These included deep soil preparation, compost-heavy fertilization, and careful crop rotation to maintain soil health. After the war, economic abundance quietly pushed these skills out of everyday life. When the war ended, the immediate pressures that had created this system disappeared. International trade reopened. Industrial agriculture expanded rapidly. Supermarkets began offering inexpensive year-round produce shipped from distant regions. For governments and consumers alike, centralized food systems seemed far more convenient. Gradually, allotment gardens were abandoned or converted into housing developments. Lawns replaced vegetable beds. By the 1950s and 1960s, many wartime gardening manuals were out of print. The industrial food system made personal food production appear unnecessary. And when something seems unnecessary for long enough, the knowledge behind it tends to fade. Modern supply chains are efficient, but also far more fragile than wartime planners would have preferred. The contrast between wartime food systems and modern ones is striking. Today, many cities rely on complex supply chains that stretch across continents. Food often travels thousands of kilometers before reaching a grocery store shelf. Under normal conditions, this system is extraordinarily efficient, but efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. Wartime planners understood that decentralized production, millions of small gardens created redundancy. If one area failed, others continued producing. Modern systems prioritize scale and specialization. Large farms produce enormous quantities of single crops, but disruption in transportation, fuel supply, or logistics can ripple quickly through the entire system. This does not mean that societies should abandon modern agriculture, but it does explain why survival planners and historians often revisit the lessons of wartime gardening. They represent a proven model of civilian resilience under extreme pressure. The deeper lesson of the World War II garden is not nostalgia, but preparedness. There is a tendency to romanticize victory gardens as symbols of national unity or home front patriotism. Those elements certainly existed, but the deeper lesson is more practical. Wartime societies recognized that food security could not rely entirely on distant producers. They built systems where ordinary citizens played a direct role in maintaining supply. The tools were simple: soil, seeds, compost, and careful planning. What made the system effective was organization and shared knowledge. When millions of people understand how to grow, store, and preserve food, even at a small scale, the entire society becomes more resilient. That was true in 1943, and in many ways it remains true today. Remembering these forgotten systems helps us understand how societies survive disruption. The story of the World War II garden is rarely emphasized in standard histories of the war. Battles, generals, and political decisions dominate the narrative. But wars are also sustained by quieter systems: food production, logistics, and civilian endurance. Victory gardens were part of that hidden infrastructure. They demonstrate how ordinary people adapted to a crisis by rediscovering practical knowledge that had existed for generations, and they remind us that resilience is rarely built in the moment of emergency. It is built beforehand through skills, habits, and systems that appear ordinary until they become essential. If you value deep historical analysis and the survival lessons hidden inside these overlooked stories, consider subscribing to Logistics of Survival. And if you think more people should understand how wartime societies actually sustain themselves, share this video so the knowledge continues to circulate.